thank you. It's a pleasing thing to me that it's not Senator Tester who's departing the committee, but you, because I couldn't find anything nice to say about Senator Tester. But if you say that, I'll believe it. But I would take this moment to thank you for your leadership on this committee and your love, care, and compassion for the United States Senate, for the citizens of Georgia, and most particularly in this instance, for the veterans of America. I've been in a number of settings where you've received accolades and toasts and cheers on the back, pats on the back and cheers, a lot about who you are as a person, a man who was interested in bipartisanship, a person who cares about this institution for its well-being and the well-being of America, your willingness to, in addition to working across the aisle, trying to find right answers and treating people with respect. Those are things that ought to be able to be said about every person in public life, and unfortunately, it's more rare than it should be. And so for you and the way you treat people and the role model that you provide for those of us who serve in public service, I thank you for that. I can't imagine that one would want to be known more than being a good person. But I would add to that, there's not a veteran in this country who hasn't benefited by what you have done on their behalf, and I commend you for that, and I respect you for that. And should Senator Tester retire or be defeated, I'll work on something to say about him as well.
We'll learn to love him.
I appreciate you having this hearing and the leadership that many around the table have led on toxic exposure. My particular interest was piqued in 2014 when I attended a conference in Wichita, Kansas, hosted by the Vietnam Veterans of America on toxic exposure, and visited with veterans who certainly experienced the consequences of that exposure themselves. But what captured my attention even more than that was the realization, the belief, the recognition that there are those who are the children and grandchildren of those veterans who it is believed are experiencing consequences from their mother, father, their grandparents' exposure to toxic substances. And we set out to try to do something to find out what the nature of the relationship is between toxic exposure for a veteran, for a military man or woman, and those who follow them, their predecessors, their children and grandchildren. And my guess is that most every serviceman or woman recognizes that they are creating risk for themselves, but what a tremendous burden it must be to recognize that something you did in service to your country has a consequence to those who are in your family who are yet to be born. And so I'll save my questions for the second panel. I'm interested in the scientific nature of the study that's been completed. Senator Blumenthal and I teamed up on this issue. We introduced legislation that would require a scientific study, review and assessment conducted by the National Academy of Sciences regarding the toxicological and epidemiological research on descendants of individuals with toxic exposure. I'm interested in hearing more about what the results from the National Academy of Science is, so that we can set the stage to care for those who, through no actions of their own, now may be suffering from the actions of the patriotic service of their parents and grandparents. And Senator Tester and I, we teamed up to try to get legislation passed, which we were successful, that declassifies records of veterans exposed to toxins so they can better pursue their claims. One of the things we learned, I learned in those conversations with those veterans that day in Wichita, was that we can't often prove our case to the Department of Veterans Affairs because of the places that we served, the circumstances we served under, and the records simply aren't available. And so that bill, as part of NDAA a year or so ago, became law, and I needed to follow up and make certain that there is a consequence to the law changing and that veterans have greater access to those records. And I would suggest to this panel that we are spending a lot of money on information services. The DOD, in my view, ought to be able to collect, it's a bit of what Senator Sullivan was talking about, ought to be able to collect information when that military man or woman returns and enters into the care of the VA, that's the moment as you tell your personal history and your medical history, that's a point in which that serviceman and woman ought to be able to tell their story. But I also would say that with the new electronic health records that we have underway, that could be the place to capture the exposure information and track conditions, not only of that military man or woman and soon-to-be veteran, but also their family members as well. And so I would recommend to the VA, if you're not specifically looking at electronic medical records, that ought to be an awfully good place to start, as we presumably are on a path that puts the Department of Defense and the Department of Veterans Affairs in the same system. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to make those remarks, and I'll save my questions for panel 2.